David Murphy, Dion Black,
Eleanor O'Brien,
Tygo Sullivan, Stacey Richter, Sarah Van Dale.
In a land far away, there once lived a rich man in a fine mansion and a poor man who lived in a hovel nearby. The rich man lived well, but his neighbour's life was hard and wretched, for Misery lived in his house. Misery sat in the chimney corner. He made the poor man's fire smoke and burn low so that his house was never warm. Misery sat at the poor man's table and breathed upon his food, so that with what little meat he had was tough and tasteless. Worst of all, Misery slept in the poor man's bed between him and his wife, so they turned their backs upon one another and shivered under the thin blankets. Then one spring morning the wife looked out at the earth newly waking and the flowers coming into bloom. She thought, our life would not be so very bad if only Misery did not live with us.
So she spoke kindly to her husband and asked him if he could find some way to drive Misery out. Her husband was touched by her words, and he sat and thought. Then he went into his woodshed and picked up a plank of wood. He called to his wife, and together they set out into the wild wood. After they had walked some way, the man looked back and saw Misery pursuing them. Then he reached a deep stream, and her husband put down the plank for his wife to walk across. Quickly he followed her, pulling up the plank before Misery could reach it. But when he glanced back, he saw that Misery had moved a huge tree trunk so that he could cross the stream, and was still following behind. The poor man knew an old hollow tree deep in the wood. When he reached it, he put down the plank, cut a branch from the tree, and began to shape some wooden wedges. Misery came closer to seeing what he was doing.
I can't stand living with Misery any longer, the man said loudly to his wife. I am going to shut myself up in a hollow tree where he can never get me again. You must drive in the wedges, wife, to hold the plank fast and keep him out. I will do it, husband, said the wife, for she saw that her husband was setting a trap. Misery could not bear to see the poor man escape him, so at the last moment he sprang into the hollow tree just as the man was climbing in. At once the man jumped out again, and with his wife's help put the plank in place and drove the wedges home. When it was done, the poor man and his wife looked at one another and laughed for the first time in many years. With Misery gone, the couple walked home hand in hand, and it seemed that their luck had already was changing, for they found a purse with some gold coins lying in the road. Soon the poor man's house was a very different place. The fire burned brightly, the food tasted good. With Misery gone from their bed, the vegetables in the garden flourished, and they had enough to sell at market. The hens laid more eggs, and soon they made enough money to buy a pig. The wife sang as she swept the house clean. With Misery gone, life was worth living at last. But the man was still afraid that Misery might escape from the hollow tree and come back to plague them. So each week he went to the tree to make sure the wedges were still tight. If any seemed loose, he would hammer them in again. Now the rich man had noticed how his poor neighbour prospered.
He has found some treasure, he thought. He goes into the wood each week to take a little more gold from his store. So the next time the poor man went into the wood, the rich man followed him. Watching from the bushes, he saw the poor man hammering away at the wedges. Ah, thought the rich man, so that's where he keeps his treasure. Although he was wealthy, he was greedy for more gold. He waited until the poor man had gone and quickly knocked out the wedges to see what was hidden in the hollow tree. At once Misery leapt out. He was so pleased to be free that he followed the rich man home, and from that day lived in his house instead. Riches are no guard against misery.
It takes love and kindness, and sometimes a little cunning to keep misery at bay. The end.